Hello everyone, my name is Mark McLean, the ancestral cousin to William Wallace and direct descendant of Robert the Bruce, leading the charge for the drug liberty revolution, and today I want to talk about why we should legalize all drugs. Now, this topic can definitely be a bit touchy, and that's because drugs are so taboo in our society, but I think that makes it all the more important to discuss drug legalization in order for us to have a healthy democracy and potential social progress moving forward. So let's jump right into it. My first reason for legalizing all drugs is liberty, and that might not be terribly surprising because my channel name is Drug Liberty for All. But I think it's something that's very important and should be important to all democracies across the world. In fact, our founding fathers gifted us with this beautiful constitution and document that is the Declaration of Independence that fundamentally protects the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the way our founding fathers saw things is that drug use was basically something you could do within your liberty and pursuit of happiness, because it does not infringe on the rights of others. In fact, for almost all of human history's drug legalization was the norm, not drug prohibition. And our founding fathers partook in many drugs, including alcohol, tobacco, they grew hemp, but they also used opium. It's documented that George Washington used an opium tincture for his dental pain, and also Thomas Jefferson actually grew opium on his estate and used it both medicinally and recreationally. Now, the only reasons our founding father didn't actually protect this right in the Constitution is because they thought it so politically outlandish at the time that anyone would want to prohibit this act because it does not infringe on the rights of others. So they didn't even think of it when they were drafting the Constitution. Now, the next reason why I believe we should legalize all drugs is that the real harms of drugs are vastly overstated and they're actually increased by prohibition. So when most people think of drugs and their dangers, they think of them automatically as addictive and harmful for your health. When you look at the actual scientific data, that just simply isn't true. And one of the best ways we can contextualize the harms of drugs is by comparing them to alcohol. So this is exactly what the Drug Science Foundation did in the UK. They compared every single psychoactive drug in the mainstream and ranked them in terms of their harms. And the results surprised the world, even though you probably haven't heard of it. They put alcohol as the number one most harmful drug, even on a list with heroin, crack, and meth. So alcohol was more harmful to the individual user and also to society as a whole than all other drugs. And that's because alcohol is actually a toxin. And most other drugs are not directly toxic to your body. Sometimes they'll have some toxic effects to specific areas in your body, but alcohol is toxic to every single cell in your body, which is why it works so well as an antiseptic agent, because it kills life forms. So bringing this a little bit further, we can how does alcohol stack up to some drugs that you might know of? So alcohol has a comparable addiction rate to low to moderate strength opioids, benzodiazepines, cocaine, and orally consumed amphetamines. So these drugs are equally addictive as alcohol. And then you have more strong drugs like heroin, crack, and meth. Now, these are more addictive to alcohol, but they're less damaging physically and socially than alcohol is. And what we can see also from that is that a lot of the harms that you see from drugs is that you only see the worst case scenario. So you only see the people going into rehab. Afterward, they're going to talk about their drug use. You don't see the people who are functional addicts talking about their drug use. You don't see people who are recreational users openly talk about their drug use because they'll get stigmatized. And what that's done is created a narrative where we think of drugs only leading to these crazy addiction stories, basically, when there's actually a wide spectrum of drug users. So only about 10 to maximum 25% of drug users actually get addicted to drugs, which is comparable to alcohol's 15 to 20% addiction rate. And then even within that, only a fraction of those people that develop an addiction are going to have a really severe addiction. So most people will be functioning addicts, or they'll be people that, binge drink or binge use and then go on periods where they, recover and then go back to it. And also, the harms of these drugs are exacerbated by prohibition. So with things like heroin, meth, and crack, for example, there's a lot of things that make them more harmful because of prohibition, whereas if people had access to a regulated market, they wouldn't be engaging in the type of behavior they're engaging in. So we, associate, crack or heroin users as people who also commit crimes. Part of the reason they commit crimes is that drug prices are inflated because of prohibition. So a kilo of cocaine might cost $5,000 in Colombia. By the time it reaches the other side of the world, it can be $150,000, and that cost is carried down to the user. So an alcoholic can get, a pretty big bottle of alcohol for $10, whereas someone who's using heroin or crack can only maybe get one hit for $10. Therefore, they're going to have to spend a lot more money to sustain themselves throughout the day. And what that will lead to is them engaging in criminal activity such as burglary and sex work, which can be damaging to the individual if they don't want to engage in that, and damaging to society, obviously, with all the theft and crime associated with that. Whereas the person addicted to alcohol is going to be less likely to engage in those criminal activities to get money because their drug, it doesn't have an overly inflated price. So another harm that we see that's exacerbated by prohibition is drugs being tainted by adulterants. So the overdose crisis is by largely due to fentanyl contaminating the drug supply. When fentanyl wasn't in the drug supply, like 10, 20 years ago, overdose rates were either half or less than half of what they are today. And just a quick fact for you, alcohol kills up to 100,000 people every year in the U.S. Even on the worst year of this overdose crisis, I think it killed about 72,000 people. So, and that's all drugs combined. So all drugs combined still kill less every year than alcohol does. And most of those deaths from drugs are due to contaminants, accidental overdoses because of the unclean drug supply. So let me compare someone that's addicted to heroin but has access to a clean supply. And they've done this in other countries. Canada has safe supply programs where a doctor can prescribe legal drugs to a drug user so they don't have to get off the street. Switzerland has a heroin program where they prescribe heroin to heroin addicts so they don't have to get off the street. And what they've seen with these programs is that the person can stop hustling for money all the time. So it frees up a lot of their time and energy, and they also don't have to deal with the tainted supply, so they're much less likely to overdose as well. And also, because they have all this time and energy freed up and money freed up, they can use that time, energy, and money into more productive things to improve their lives. So they can start looking for jobs, they can get housing easier, and they become, basically, they turn into what we call a street junkie, if you wanted to be demeaning, and they basically turn into a functioning addict, where they're a functioning member of society that just happens to use a drug like heroin. And that's something that we could do if we were to legalize drugs. So it would not only benefit society with liberty, as I said before, but it's going to benefit drug users because they're not going to be at risk of overdose. And if they are addicted, they'll have a clean supply and be able to engage in medical care in a more productive way. Now, the other major thing that Prohibition does is create a black market. And what this does is makes crime flood all across cities around the world, basically. And because they cannot use the legal system to settle disputes, they use violence. So a lot of the violence we see around cities is because of drug wars, whereas and this is the same thing that happened with alcohol prohibition. There's a huge increase in criminal activity and criminal violence. And that was one of the major reasons we considered alcohol prohibition a failure. And this is the same thing for drug prohibition. If we were to legalize drugs, we would take this valuable product off their hands, and that's a huge money blow to these organizations. Or they would just flip over and become legal, functioning members of society and work within the regulatory bodies to, continue dealing with these drugs, but they would leave the violence and the criminal activity out of it. So this undermines the safety of our nation, the safety of our people, and also completely destroys some developing countries like Mexico. Southeast Asian countries have dealt with this as well, because these organizations are able to get so much money from dealing with the black market of drugs that they kind of undermine the national government and can have more power than the government or infiltrate the government and make it corrupt, basically. So that's also a huge problem when it comes to drug prohibition, and a huge harm of drug prohibition that's probably more harmful than the drugs themselves. Now, the next thing we can look at with why we should legalize drugs is that the positives of drug use are vastly understated. Now, everyone, as I said before, everyone just talks about the most extreme bad examples of what drugs can do to you, and no one talks about the good things that can come of drugs. Now, this is changing somewhat with medical marijuana being legalized. People are starting to recognize there's medical benefits to cannabis and also social benefits to consuming cannabis. This is also starting to happen with psychedelics. They're going, things like magic mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy are going through clinical trials and are expected to be approved within the next few years, because they've been proven to work so well on treating treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, whole addiction, OCD, a whole host of mental health disorders. But the same thing can also be said of things like opioids and stimulants. Now, opioids, we know, can be really good for treating pain. If you have an accident and you have a broken bone and you go to the hospital, you're going to probably want an opioid to treat that pain. But it can also have some pro-social effects as well. It can act as a social lubricant, just like alcohol can. And especially if you're using these things in mild or moderate doses, as they've done historically, you can use it similarly to alcohol without having major downsides. As I said, low to moderate strength opioids are similar addiction rates to alcohol and far less harm, and you can use them in the same way that you would having a social event. And also, we're seeing this historically, and we're starting to study it again more recently, is that opioids have a pretty impressive antidepressant effect. So they're just starting to study this now with buprenorphine, but we've known this for hundreds, if not thousands of years that opioids are an effective antidepressant. Many addicts are starting to come out and say that that's why they use, that's why they continue to use, that's why they continue to use their buprenorphine and methadone, is because they just simply don't feel happy unless they have an opioid in their system. And many of these people are well-functioning members of society. The same thing can go for stimulants. Especially amphetamine has historically been used for depression, also fatigue as well, and cocaine and coca-tea as well there. So the positives of drug use are usually just completely ignored in the public discussion, and I think that's something important to bring up if we want to seriously talk about drug legalization, because it's not just a public health issue, it's also a liberty issue, and we should have access to these pharmaceutical compounds that can potentially help us with our personal lives. Now, with all that said, even if you do support legalization, most people have a very vague idea of what that would even look like. So I want to talk about what legalization looks like. That way we can actually go forward with a clear picture in our head on what would it look like if we ended the drug war and ended prohibition. Now I'm doing a whole separate video on this that'll go super in depth, but I'll just go over the kind of the key points here today. So legalization can obviously look like many things. It can be a free market thing, as it was 100 years ago, where you just go to your corner store and pick up heroin and cocaine products. Coca-Cola was originally marketed this way in a free market drug society. But a much more responsible way to do this, because if you let the capitalism get out of hand, as it has for tobacco, as many people are frustrated at the pharmaceutical companies doing with opioids, it can, damage society in other ways. Just like prohibition can damage it, kind of over-marketing drugs can also damage society. So a better middle ground is kind of having a strict legal regulation of these drugs. And again, we can use alcohol as our kind of marker for how we should do this. Now, alcohol, as I said, is actually somewhat of a hard drug, especially if you take hard alcohol. It probably shouldn't be sold in stores and so readily available in the way it is. Beer and wine, maybe, that would be okay, but hard alcohol should not be as widespread as it is today. So we would be taking a model that's sort of based on alcohol, but a little more responsible even. So what that looks like is a 3-tier system where you have lower level drugs that are treated similar to alcohol. So you have things like coca-tea, the natural plant that people make cocaine from. You have opium, which obviously you make all sorts of pharmaceutical compounds from that. Kratom, cat, some lesser known natural compounds, and all of these natural plants have addiction rate and harm rates that are less than alcohol. So the most reasonable way to regulate these would just say, let's just treat like alcohol. You have an age limit. You have certain regulations. If you want to open up a tea house for coca or opium, you have to get a license, and then you can kind of treat like cannabis as well, where people can get dispensary license, and you can go down to the dispensary, show your ID, and you can pick up your products there. So it's kind of a loose regulations, but it's still within these strict parameters of where and how you can sell it. And again, these are for these lower level drugs that have been used for hundreds, if thousands of years. Then you have your mid-level drugs, these drugs that are kind of equivalent to hard alcohol in their addiction rates and potential harm. So that would include things like morphine, amphetamine, which is Adderall, MDMA. You have benzodiazepines maybe would be included in this, and these would be all behind the pharmacy counter. There's no branding, there's no marketing, and you have to pick it up at the pharmacy where they can give you, basically information on it like they would a prescription medication. Or you can do this in a dispensary with pharmacy technicians, kind of similar to a pharmacy setup, but it's its own exclusive thing. And you'd have limited it to one purchase a day. And then if people want more than one purchase a day, or if they're addicted to these drugs, or if they are using drugs that have a higher addiction rate than alcohol, things like heroin, crack, and methamphetamine, that would be prescription only. And this is called safe supply. It's a harm reduction model, and it's been proven to work in other countries throughout the world, where if you're addicted to one of the substance like meth, crack, or heroin, or if you're addicted to a lower level drug and you need high continued doses of it, you go to a doctor, they give you a prescription of it. That way it eliminates the risks and damages of the black market. You get your drug, but you still go on with your life. You can become a functional addict, and also you have an established relationship with the doctor and the medical community. And that way, if you have a health problem, or if you ever want to seek help for your addiction using some sort of rehab or therapy or whatever other treatment, you have an established relationship with the doctor. And this has also been proven very helpful in improving the quality of life of people who are addicted to these drugs, and also eventually getting these people off drugs when they want to. So these are all the reasons why I think we should legalize drugs. So it's everything from personal liberty to the fact that the real harms of drugs are vastly overstated, and they're actually lower than alcohol in almost every single instance. The positives of drug use are well understated, and I think our society and many individuals could benefit from using these particular drugs. Let's say if you had access to coca tea and opium tea, maybe you would use that sometimes instead of using alcohol, which can be more damaging on your body and your health and possibly more addictive. And also it helps people with addiction, and it helps society in general because it eliminates a black market which funds billions of dollars into criminal organizations, which results in violent crimes for thousands of people all around the world every single year. So I think it's kind of, once you know all the facts, I think legalization becomes a no-brainer, and then especially when you know how it can be implemented, which again, I'll upload a video all about that, in a safe and regulated manner. Again, it becomes even more of a no-brainer and simple solution to all the drug problems that we have in our society today. So if you like this video, leave a comment below, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.